Today's episode of the Occasional Podcast is brought to you by DCS. Since 1987, DCS has been at the forefront of digital audio, creating standard-setting, life-enhancing products that are a unique synthesis of exact science and creative imagination. All DCS products are designed and manufactured in the United Kingdom, using proprietary technologies and material and components of the highest quality. A carefully judged balance of their unique heritage and world-class engineering ensures there is a rich history of groundbreaking innovation inside every DCS system, resulting in playback systems that are unrivaled in their ability to make music. For more information, visit DCSLTD.CO.UK. Today's show is also brought to you by WELLPLEASEDAV. Importer Mark Sosa has hand-selected a remarkable collection of high-performance, high-value brands like Vinnie Rossi, Inuos, Swiss Cables, QLN, Qualiton, Gigawatt, and more that are driven by a passion for excellence in reproducing music effortlessly and naturally. Check out everything Well-Pleased AV has to offer by visiting www.WELLPLEASEDAV.com. Everybody, thanks so much for joining us today. First episode of Season 4. My very special co-host, Bryan Beasley.
Hello, Brian Hunter. It is so good to see you virtually. This is our first time not doing the podcast in the same room.
I know. Unfortunately, the recent outbreak of COVID-19 is keeping us apart, but we're managing. This is, Beasley's broadcasting from the comfort of his own home, which I think is probably nicer for him. The title of today's podcast is What is Mastering, and what does it mean when an album is remastered? We seek to answer this very delicate question through the help of our esteemed colleague and friend, mastering engineer Dave McNair and Grover Neville. So, Bees, before we dive right into it, I kind of wanted to catch up with you a little bit because something interesting did happen to you over this break in the quarantine. Can you give me an update on your life? What's been going on?
Yeah, something completely random did kind of happen. There was a thing that went around on the socials. The Getty Museum put out a challenge where you could pick a piece of their art from their collection and you basically kind of recreate it with household items. And so we did a few. We made it like a family project, and my eldest daughter, who's 5, Layla, she got to pick the photos, and she was in one or two, and then we did one that actually kind of went viral. As a matter of fact, you can find it in People magazine this week, which is completely crazy. My daughter picked out this one painting called Portrait of a Lady from the 1600s, and we dressed my wife up in my bathrobe, and we put, we kind of puffed her up a little bit and put like tinsel on her. But the big thing that we did that kind of is what made it catch on is that in the original painting, the woman has this very elaborate lace collar, like it's massive. And it looks like when those dogs come back from the vet and they can't lick anywhere, so they put those cones. It literally looks like this woman's wearing one of those in lace style. So we hung like a bunch of full rolls of toilet paper around her neck, and it totally caught on. Like, obviously there's a bit of sense of humor in it. My photography skills came in handy, and PBS did a whole thing on us, and then People magazine picked it up. And even today, this is completely random. Someone now has done fan art. They've done a painting of the photo I did of a painting from the 1600s. It's very meta. So that's the new post that I put out today. It was this young artist, I think out of New Hampshire, did this fan art. And I'm like, this is crazy. I never would have thought.
Yeah, man, that's pretty wild. And now to take an unfortunate slight pivot to audio news, as many of you guys probably are aware, a lot of the audio shows, well, let's just say all of them, are pretty much canceled. There's no real world, reason or anywhere to go to listen to music together as a community, and that's very unfortunate. So the latest news out of the stable is, however, the show in Los Angeles is canceled. They originally were trying to push it back, but they had some issues with their hotel, and it is now canceled for 2020. Expona has been canceled. Munich has been canceled. Can Jam has been postponed till next year for quite a few of them. So it's just been kind of a bummer all around. Obviously, this is there are bigger things in life that are being impacted than just listening to audio, of course.
But it still sucks. It still sucks.
So the good news is, though, and in kind of a weird way, this is just me with a very small group of people I've talked to, but it doesn't quite appear that supply chains are being really backed up. There are some particular items that are some manufacturers are having a hard time getting, but surprisingly, not everyone is really feeling the heat horribly right now in certain sectors. So when it comes to like the dealer networks and the 2-channel crowd, they are being impacted pretty greatly because, people can't go to the dealers and they can't hear music live and they can't do it with the dealers there. But surprisingly, in a couple of weird ways, direct headphone manufacturers in the headphone space seem to be doing okay. I'm not saying everybody's doing awesome and great because obviously everybody is being affected by the lower economy, but sales aren't slumping as hard as other avenues because think about this. It's crazy, I thought, in a way. People are at home. They're contained with their significant others and their families. And what better way to listen than with headphones so you don't disturb the rest of the family? So headphone sales and headphone gear really aren't as slumping, from what I can tell, as hard as, obviously 2-channel because your family would hear it and because of this dealer network issue. So
and there's also the aspect, Brian, that you're forgetting of the don't want to listen to your you don't want to hear the other people in your house. Go get the trash. No, I don't think so.
So that's kind of my take on it. I know there's many more nuances than that to the whole kind of economy of it all, but that's just an interesting kind of thing I've found. So it's not awesome, but we're making do with what we got.
Hey,
I think
we'll take the bright spots as we can get them, right?
And on other bright spots, product announcements haven't really been curtailed too much. They're still kind of powering forward. We got a couple of new things, about 5 points here real quick. Estelle & Kern has a new A and Norma line, this SR25 DAP, their digital audio player. The entry-level one is actually the slanted screen one they have. I thought was kind of a cool design thing they did. And this entry-level player is replacing the SR15 at the same price point, $699 price point. A lot of stuff you can check out online to kind of see that. The U.S. and Latin America distribution for Rotel was actually recently acquired by Sumiko. That's the Macintosh brands, World of Macintosh, that kind of thing, brands distribution arm. So now they are doing distribution for those two areas for Rotel. That's kind of a big change. PS Auto has 2 new products out. One, a pair of stellar monoblocks, 800 watts into 8 ohms, called the M1200 for $6K a pair. And also a new 3K integrated called the Stella Strata with a digital section, streaming module, Class A amplifier, 100 watts into 8 ohms. So 2 new products from them. Campfire Audio recently released a new model called the ARA, 7 balanced armature drivers in that. Also updates for the Solaris and the Andromeda called the respective models 2020 version. I'm a big fan of the Andromeda. I always have been. So the new 2020 model, kind of interesting proposal. See how that could go. Just announced on Facebook a new Noble audio flagship called the Sultan. Very on brand with that name, I think. For $2,900. Uses what they're called tri-level hybrid technology. That is 3 types of driver technology all packed into the earphone. 1 10mm dynamic driver, 4 balanced armature drivers, and 2 ultra-frequency electrostatic drivers, all in one little tiny IM. So, pretty fun stuff. I also want to thank DCS for supporting this podcast. They have something kind of cool. It's they just implemented called the DCS Legends Award. That is an acknowledgement of outstanding efforts of a select group of recording, mixing, and mastering engineers who strive throughout their careers to deliver the finest music listening experience possible. So they're honoring a couple of really great guys who are very concerned about relaying the best fidelity across the thing to our ears, which I think we can all celebrate. And guess who one of the winners is, Bees?
Oh, man, I was just about to ask you. Yeah, do we know any of the people?
Our friend Al Schmidt at Capitol Studios.
Love us some Al Schmidt. I mean, you kidding me? Some of the two of the best podcasts we ever did. I could talk to that guy for hours. Just about how he cleans his ears.
He was a great interview. He has so many good stories, and he actually put out a book as well. So he's a wealth of information. He's recorded everybody from Frank Sinatra to Toto. He actually worked on some of those huge Toto tracks that became so famous, and he's been around.
Paul McCartney does the forward to his book.
You can check more out about that at DCSLTDdotCOM, or they actually have a podcast with interviews. So if you want to search for that podcast, it's called the DCS Legends, The Other Side of the Glass, available on Apple iTunes or Spotify. Let's talk about mastering a little bit. You know, one of the most interesting things I found from the interview was that mastering wasn't exactly what I kind of thought it was.
So what did you think it was?
That's a really great question. I thought that it was involved more with mixing and mastering are two different steps. And the mastering, one of the key things they do, according to Dave McNair, is that they help manage the levels from track to track, because so many people have their hands in the production process that you get inconsistency, and mastering helps keep things consistent from song to song. Now, it's much more complicated than that, and they do a lot of other crazy stuff, but they do balance the EQ at that point as well to kind of give it an overall sound. And through that, they can actually adjust the way you kind of receive it and perceive instruments. So it's a very interesting and complicated process, and they have some really new, cool tools to help them kind of do even more stuff now than they could ever before.
Yeah, they really do. You're totally right. They really do talk about how different the job was when they were, if they were mastering something that was going to vinyl back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and how that's all changed with digital, and how good the equipment, I guess that's any technology, how good the equipment's gone. I actually found a great article. Gear Patrol magazine last April put out a whole thing about what mastering and remastering is. As we've talked about in this podcast, I'm a huge vinyl fan, and they just talked about the actual mastering part of the vinyl from the original tapes, the different frequencies, and if it was important to kind of definitely level those, and records spin at different speeds in the center than they do on the outside. So the high frequencies need to be adjusted so the album sounds the same from start to finish. Definitely sounds like the job has completely evolved as they've moved from, analog to digital. And Dave does a great job in this interview of kind of going in depth of the two different halves that was.
If you check out the interview, I think it does a really good job of kind of giving you a sense of what to look out for if you're going to spend more money on a reissue, which is also a really important thing, because a remaster is not necessarily a remix, right? They're different things. Like a full remix, you might hear some different kind of crazy stuff. And what's a special edition? And when it gives you the tools you need to look at what's out there and what you want and what you want to get from it in any type of reinvestment into your favorite album.
Yeah, and what to look out for, too, because when I Googled basically worst remastered albums, and to no surprise, it's one of the greatest selling albums of all time. Michael Jackson's Thriller, I guess, was remastered 4 different times, and I guess by the 4th time that they remastered it, basically all they did is just kept making it louder and louder. People were like, why would you mess up a well-engineered record? And there was this loudness race, in the late 90s and early 2000s, and that's all they wanted. And boy, does Dave and Grover really go in depth about having to deal with artists going, I just want it to be loud, man, and kind of having to explain what that will do to the final product.
I think it's really interesting because at the end of the day, these guys are hired for a job and they don't have the final say on what the record sounds like. The client has the final say. They can have their input. Hopefully they have a bunch of great input to help steer the clients, and they can convince the clients. But at the end of the day, the person who pays for it gets what they want. So not all the blame for poorly remastered music lands solely on the shoulders of the mastering engineer that did it.
Yeah, there's only so much they can do. Yeah, if you're not going to take their years and years of experience, then that's kind of on you. And we've talked about remastered stuff. I mean, Abbey Road, we did a whole podcast when the 50-year anniversary came out. It was a full remaster going back to the original tapes. I think that was even a remix, right? Didn't they even go in and remix some of it?
If I had to guess, I would say it was a remix, because I heard kind of a lot of change in that one.
But the one thing they do kind of put up a red flag is using the term remaster as a marketing ploy. It's almost kind of like slapping the word organic on everything in a grocery store,
You had an interesting metaphor that you were using earlier. Remember what that was?
Dave really goes into this, and they talked about how you have to like put out the best product there is, but that sometimes because stuff is being so condensed or compressed or, being put through so many different mechanisms, I guess, before it actually hits your ears, that certain frequencies just get lost. And I can totally relate to that because as a photographer, one of my main sources of getting my work out there is Instagram. I'll have like a massive major shoot where I've, poured all this money or the clients poured all this money into doing really exciting images and then put them on Instagram. And I'm like, why does this photo look nothing like it does in the magazine or the way it's put out in print? And it's just because it's been condensed and shrunk down, and that's just the world we live in. So it's unfortunate.
Yeah. And even with this podcast, we record at, high resolution audio, believe it or not, for the most part, and we mix at high resolution. But in order to get it to you guys, it's a requirement that podcasts be down sampled to a more manageable size, and that's usually there's a maximum MP3. So you guys are listening to an MP3, but the origin story of this podcast is much higher quality. So it's a little bit sad that you guys don't get to hear it like we hear it, but you know what? To push it through the distribution channel, it has to be done this way.
Correct. And I mean, it is unfortunate because it is our audience's loss because my speaking voice is like Streisand. I mean, it is pure butter. And I'm sorry that you're getting margarine.
So on that note, what is remastering? What does it mean when an album is remastered? Dave McNair and Grover Neville. Bees?
Punch it, Chewy.
Today's episode is also brought to you by Audio Research Corporation. Since 1970, Audio Research has remained dedicated to the advancement of state-of-the-art in music reproduction and was the pioneer of the high-end audio revolution and owner of the high-definition trademark. Enjoy music the way it was truly meant to be heard with Audio Research. Visit AUDIORESEARCH.com to learn more. What is mastering, and what does it really mean when a record is remastered? And to help us explore this very interesting subject, we have two experts in the field, Grover Neville and Dave McNair. Thanks so much for joining us, guys.
Hey, Brian.
Hello. Thanks for having us, Brian. Hi, Dave.
Hey, Grover.
So, Grover Neville, he works in the production side of things. You can tell us just a little bit about your experience?
Yeah, so I went to school, Oberlin Conservatory, and did a mix of things, both performance and tech-related. And after school, I worked a bit in Chicago's kind of avant-garde classical scene, doing what can roughly be termed mixing and mastering. It was a lot of audio repair stuff. It was a lot of kind of almost audio forensic type things. Nowadays, a lot of what I do in that realm tends to be producing music for other people, from electronic to acoustic, and also doing mixing and post-production for documentaries. There's been some video game work, doing soundtrack composition. So it's a little bit of a mix of things. I tend to not do as much pure mixing and mastering for just, pop records nowadays. It tends to be a little more on the creative side, but I still do, like I said, post-production for a lot of like documentaries and things like that. So.
Dave McNair of Dave McNair Mastering, your role is a little more specific in terms of what you do. Could you kind of just cut off the slice of the pie that you work on and tell us what's up?
Well, I've done all the various varieties of production, from being the recording engineer at the beginning of the recording to somewhat of a mixing specialist. I also have produced lots of records, but about 18, 20 years ago, I decided to transition into mastering, which is the final part of the music production process.
So Dave and Grover, where in terms of when we look at a broad glimpse of the production of music, so I have a guitar and I'm about to produce a hit record, and then on the other side is the record. Could you just, Dave, walk us through what that process is like, what the steps are from idea to record?
Right. Well, and I think this is a good point to clarify, especially for for audiophiles, because I think there's, some audiophiles know a lot about the process and some are not as aware. Basically, the recording process is, in the best situation where you have some kind of a label budget or something, the hats are divided up between the people who are the musicians, roughly termed the artists, and then the production personnel. There's typically a recording engineer who is the person that's responsible for technically recording the thing, and in some cases coming up with a lot of interesting sound approaches. And that is usually recorded to a multi-track format. The multi-track format is kind of irrespective of how much of the performance is live or not, because you can have a group of 8 musicians in a studio performing live and still record to, 24 or 48 tracks or more. Or it can be a process where it starts with a very small ensemble or one person, and then the layers of sound parts, musical parts and sounds are built subsequently. So regardless of whether it's predominantly live or a production that's taken place over time, almost all records are done to a multi-track format. So what happens when you record to multi-track, whether it's digital hard disk, workstation, or whether it's tape, is it then has to be mixed. And that process involves deciding the relative levels, where the track is panned, whether it's in the middle or on one side or somewhere in between, and then various sonic touches to each individual track if needed, and also any added ambience or effects or anything like that. The mixing process is probably the most creative element of the process, and which led to people being kind of mix specialists, where they may have some recording techniques, but they may be a good recording engineer, but they've excelled at mixing, and so they're more hired for their mixing skills. Then once the thing is mixed, you have typically a stereo file or a stereo tape, and that is then mastered by somebody. Grover, you want to jump in and add anything to the production part before we talk about mastering?
It's pretty spot on, other than the fact that nowadays, and at least the circles that I run in, those processes are blurred together quite a bit more.
Right.
So,
exactly.
As a producer, sometimes you can be there in the tracking session and even doing some tracking and having input. You can be having input into the mix. And then my experience with, obviously there's a lot of bedroom studio stuff that goes on now, even at a very high level, Billie Eilish and folks like that.
Sure.
Sometimes the track is mixed, produced, and recorded and just gets sent off to a mastering engineer. So it's become a lot less.
Yeah.
It used to be in the days of analog, my understanding at least, is that it used to be a little bit more of a clearly differentiated process with specific experts in each field. And nowadays, at least, I'm young, I'm 24, right? So all I've ever known is the kind of blurred together process. But
right.
I've done both, but I've done definitely more of the second, where everyone kind of wears multiple hats.
Yeah. Well, I think both are equally valid. There's not that any idea that one is better than the other. The reason that people can basically run the entire show is because of digital computer recording is, brought the price down so where somebody can kind of learn how to do the whole thing.
You dropped the idea of the role of producer a couple of times. Does producer have a specific role, or does he just kind of go across all three of these?
Well, the producer can be, there's a wide variety. You can be everything from almost like a Rick Rubin kind of producer, where you just have this broad conceptualization of what you think an artist should do, and you just help pick the songs that are going to be on the record. Or you go, out of these 10 songs you want to record, 6 of them are good, but these other 4 suck. You need to write some more songs. Like that's like the broadest definition of a producer. To then you have the other extreme end, where you have a pop production person or team like Max Martin or Dr. Luke, and they basically do the entire thing and bring the singer in, and they sing on top of it. And then that's the only involvement that the artist has had. You know, you can be a producer-writer, and you can be very hands-on with the recording process, or you can be anywhere in the continuum of a facilitator. Back in my days when I used to produce, I mean, I would kind of help pick the songs, but a lot of times what I would do would be to try to set the mood in the studio and make arrangement suggestions like, you know what, the song is great, but I don't think you need to do a double chorus for the first time around. Why don't you wait? Let's wait and make the second chorus double. And the artist, a lot of times, it's not really their job to necessarily highly self-edit. So it's really good to have somebody come in as a editor, you know, at the very least, and go, I'm hearing this fresh. You've been living with it, and you wrote it, and it's your opus. But what do you think about having a 16-bar bridge in the middle to separate these? And you know, I mean, I've even like written bridges with the artist in the studio when we're getting ready to record it. So yeah. It can be anywhere along the continuum.
It's definitely, for me, I totally agree, Dave. I think I see it fall into three main categories, at least here in LA. One is, like you just said, if people are doing more live style, kind of what I think of as more traditional recordings. You've got like T-Bone Burnett, who's kind of your cheerleader and your taste maker, and maybe even your arranger. And then you've got sort of people on the other end of the spectrum in electronic music or hip-hop or things that are heavily digitally based in their production, a lot of pop music, where the producer is literally the instrumentalist. They program all the instruments or play all of the parts. They get all the samples, and they kind of even do like a rough mix to begin with, right? They're pretty much, they're kind of the artist, right? They do everything, like you said, except for the vocals or the, you know, the rapping or whatever it is. And in the case of EDM, the producer is usually the actual artist, right?
True, yep.
And then I think there's also a third category which kind of sits in between those, and these are the kind of people who are sort of like Prince or Jacob Collier or folks like that, who are truly both the artist and the producer, right? They do everything themselves, and the digital workspace kind of enables them to just be an all-in-one production machine.
Yeah.
So for me, those are kind of the general three categories that I see it as falling into. But it's absolutely a spectrum.
My own personal opinion is that not having access to a producer is probably the most hampering thing for a young new artist or a band.
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
It's not the recording medium or having an expensive mic or anything like that. It's being able to have somebody that's got taste and is sympathetic to what the artist is trying to achieve to come in and go, you know what, that song's great, but you need to slow it down 6 BPM. You know, really obvious things like, you know what, that song is cool, but you need to lower the key. You're at the very top of your range and you sound kind of screechy. And a lot of times artists just don't have that ability to sort of back up and see that.
It takes a huge amount of self-reflection to be able to do that.
Yep.
So the taste is important. And then also most producers are a little bit more technically savvy and a little bit more familiar with how does a song get produced, how do we, you know, what are the steps that we need to go through to actually make the song finished and polished and to get that sort of sound that people expect from records nowadays.
Yeah.
You know, I've actually heard that kind of idea extrapolated to the point where a couple of guys have come to me and said, I'm a good songwriter, producer, but I actually don't play any instruments. So they take this idea of being such a contributing element to the overall sound that they're like, I really write songs, but I can't sing or write or do anything.
Yeah.
I'm that essence that makes it great.
Well, see, I can't write songs, so I mean, I would have no problem working with that. You know, back in my producer days, I was happy to work with, you know, people that had no concept other than I've got a great song. You know, so
yeah. You know, every once in a while, people want to freshen up an album. They'll do a remaster. They'll like, hey, this thing is new. It's what you had before, but there's something new about it. It's a remaster. Dave, could you explain to us exactly what happens in that process and what is actually different about the record in that regard?
Okay. First, let me talk just briefly about, try to describe what, you know, mastering is, whether it's the initial mastering or a remastering type of thing. So you're dealing with a finished stereo mix, And what you can do in mastering, once again, it kind of falls into a fairly wide, continuum of things. At the very least, if you've got a collection of 8 or 10 tunes, and this is a little bit, anachronistic because it's like a singles world and a playlist world. But let's say we're talking about, a collection of songs. What happens is the songs are mixed one at a time. And so the mix serves the individual song and the production and the sounds within that song best to kind of achieve a thing that the artist and the production team's looking for. If you multiply that times 10, you will find that if I open up 10 songs in an album, frequently they'll be at different levels. One might be a lot brighter than the other. One might have a lot more bass than the other. At its entry level, the mastering would be just to put the songs in the order that everybody wants, with the spaces between them that are deemed, like maybe you bang the first 3 or 4 together tight, and then you kind of make the space bigger as there's no rules for that, but I'm the one that decides how much space there is between the songs. Then you kind of make the relative levels similar enough to where if you were listening to the whole thing, you wouldn't feel like you constantly wanted to turn the volume up and down. And then if you are doing everything at home and you finished your 10-song opus and you listen and you put it, drive around in the car and you're listening to your tunes, if you have this knee-jerk reaction to want to turn the treble or the bass up or down on various tunes, that's what I'm doing. So it's like I'm the tone adjuster so that you don't have to, you're not kind of subconsciously compelled to adjust the tone as the thing plays.
So what you're saying is there's definitely an element of consistency across all the tracks.
Yeah. Okay. And that doesn't mean that you have to make every song sound exactly the same. That's not what you want to do either. You can go, it's subtle, but you can do a lot toward making the whole album more listenable by making small tonal adjustments and level adjustments. So that's basically what the mastering is.
Wait, so you said level there. So there you could adjust an overall level, but never the mix. Is that correct? You don't go in.
You can adjust individual elements in the mix, but you can turn the whole song up or down.
Okay, and so because what you get is a stereo.
Correct.
It's like flattened, right? In photography, it'd be a flattened stereo mix.
Yeah.
You can't adjust those after that.
No, but you can, with equalization, you can kind of create a perception that the various elements maybe are presented differently. Like if you had, if you had acoustic guitars panned hard left and right, I felt like the whole thing would feel better and sound better if the whole thing was brighter. If I bring up the top end or bring up 8K or something, it won't just make the mix feel like it's got more treble. It'll perceptibly bring those things with high frequencies will seem closer to you. They'll seem louder. So
that's
yeah.
That's actually a really important point that Dave is making. So on the one hand, getting the album to sound coherent is actually much more difficult than it sounds. It sounds, you just go and you give everything the same EQ. It's like, well, all the tracks probably have different levels when they're sent to you, and they have different mixes and they have different effects and all that. So it's quite a bit more tedious in my experience than just
especially if it's been mixed by like 3 or 4 different people.
So. Exactly, especially if it's gone through a bunch of different hands or been produced by different people or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the other big point that you made, Dave, is when you are EQing a stereo mix, you get different results than when you're EQing a mono track or even a stereo just single track. And there's all sorts of weird stuff that you can do from a mastering engineer's perspective with the stereo field and EQ.
Totally.
Even just EQ and the stereo field.
Yeah.
Just to get interesting effects. And this is really where a lot of the kind of audiophile-centric things come from and is in the mastering is how can I pull out detail in the treble? And if you were the mix engineer, your gut response is going to be to go in and just pull up more treble in that track. But that has a very different effect than actually balancing the whole track's frequency or phase response.
Yeah, there's a funny thing too, and I discovered this a long time ago when I was more of a mixer. If you figure out at some point that your whole mix maybe needs to have more clarity, it's not super dull, it's not super dark, but you feel like, I just need a little more clarity to this whole thing. It sounds completely different to go into the individual tracks during the mix and add a little top end to the individual tracks than it does to add a little bit of top to the whole stereo mix. I don't know why that is exactly, but I tend to like what top end added during mastering sounds like a lot more than going for the max amount of clarity in the mix. So
it's true even for digital.
Yeah.
I've worked on enough analog consoles that you can tell there's kind of like there's almost an automatic headroom management that happens with analog mixing on consoles where, the console only has so much headroom. There's a lot of theories about why this happens, but the console only seems to have so much headroom, and it kind of, when it sums things, it almost balances things a little bit for you. It brings certain things down. It kind of just compresses everything a little bit until it is nice and glued.
Yeah.
Digital mixing doesn't quite do that as much unless you have like enormous number of tracks or you're using an emulation plugin or something. But even on digital, you're right. It's totally different to boost a single track versus the master. Something about the summing, it changes how that works.
Yeah. So, but to speak to your point of the stereo thing, one of the tools that I have, actually, it's pretty common now. It wasn't as common years ago, but it's more of a thing now, is I have a mid-side matrix built into my mastering console path where I can choose to take any of my stereo processors, typically an EQ, and instead of it being left and right, it becomes things in the middle and things on the side. So it's very powerful, and there's no sonic penalty to it. Like, my matrix is totally invisible for all intents and purposes. So what I typically do is, a lot of the music that I master is vocally oriented, and I mean, I do plenty of instrumental and jazz and stuff, but whenever I do anything that's vocally oriented, as a listener, I'm really just trying to enhance the sound of the lead vocal, and that's almost always right in the middle. So I can kind of EQ the vocal almost as if I had access to the vocal track itself without touching what happens on the sides. And I can do the same thing. I can add some top on the sides without touching what's in the middle. So like if the vocal was bright, but it sounds like things in the stereo field were just kind of nebulous, I can add detail on the sides without touching the vocal and the drums and stuff in the middle. So
yeah, and it gets super complicated too, right? You can, my mix game went up like tenfold when I learned how to use mid-side really, really well. Because you can do all sorts of you can put effects on each of those, right? You can EQ the vocal or EQ the center, right? And then send that into a compressor so the treble is hitting it less hard, but the bass is hitting it more hard, and then trigger that off of other things. So there's a ridiculous amount of complexity you can get out of just a simple routing.
It is.
Phenomena.
And so to talk about the remastering thing, I don't know if we're to the point where a remaster is really that valid. I mean, it could have been argued maybe in the early part of the millennium that there'd been, a quantum leap in analog to digital converters. And so if you basically had the EQ and the levels and everything set up exactly as it was, when the thing was mastered in, 1988 or something, you could actually get the benefit of better D to A's and A to D's, DACs and analog to digital converters. But at this point, we've had really good conversion for a long time, and so I don't think that's a compelling enough reason to remaster. So I don't know. A lot of times the remaster is just louder, and that's about it.
I think definitely you made me think of two things, Dave. One, kind of a lot of late 90s, early 2000s digital remasters of old analog just sound like casualties of the loudness war, to my ears at least. You know, there's a David Bowie Greatest Hits album. It's got like a blue background, and he's got his Ziggy Stardust outfit on. It's just his face. And the tracks sound... they just sound awful.
Yeah.
It was 2002 or 98 or something like that. And it's just, you go back and listen to the originals, even the original CDs, and they still sound a lot better. I think, just to throw in another perspective, because I do a lot of audio repair and restoration stuff. One of the interesting things that happens with old, you know, like 60s, 70s records, when they're remastered, quote unquote, is sometimes that's as much an archival process as it is an actual remastering process.
Totally.
They went back with some of the Beatles material recently, I think on the White Album, and not only did they try and stereoize all of those mono recordings, but they also did a lot of archival work to try and bring what were sort of B-roll takes up to a listenable standard.
Right.
And, you know, and preserve, you know, what was there. That blurs the line between a remix and a remaster, but some of that archiving process can be interesting with remasters. But
definitely,
but generally,
yeah.
Generally, I think the same as you that a remaster is like, why does something need to be remastered unless they like Death Magnetic, you know, if you remaster Death Magnetic, you just pull that limiter back.
Yeah, I mean, if for whatever reason at the time that it was done. And I mean, it could be a million different reasons. If it's determined sort of, 20 years after the fact that, we kind of botched whatever was going on, let's take another shot at it. Some remasters are very, very good. Especially the vinyl stuff.
Yeah, that's true.
So, I just got a copy of the first Bad Company record, and I mean, that's not a record that I would listen to very often, but it was super big when I was in high school, and my band played all those songs and stuff, and I saw it in the store the other day. I was like, oh, I got to get this. It is amazing, and it's the best kind of remaster, because not only did Miles Showell at Abbey Road do an incredible half-speed cut, they worked off the original tapes. So that's a band who, it was their first album, probably was only somewhat of a priority. They probably didn't approach, the mastering as mission critical. And so now you got somebody who goes back to the original tapes and is really doing it justice. Is it an audiophile record? No, it's not really, but I've never heard it sound better. And it's not, hyped or anything. It's just a really good transfer.
So I have a quick question for you, actually, Dave, because I don't do nearly as much mastering as you do. Do you think that in another, say, 20 to 40 years, we're going to see some of the hits from today that, especially like bedroom pop and SoundCloud rappers, get remastered in slightly clearer fidelity?
I can't imagine that happening.
Okay, I don't either. But I was curious on what your take was.
And not because it's not. I'm not making any pronouncement about the artistic nature of it, but just that.
Of course, yeah.
I think the stuff that benefits the most from remastering is either something that was very early digital or something where the multitrack and the mix were on tape, and maybe it was mastered for the first and only time in 1965. And you go, you know what? My completely pimped out Ampex ATR 102 with a Nick Doshi tape head and my modern converters are going to just, even if I do nothing additionally creative to alter the original intent of the recording, just the transfer itself is going to sound, 15% better. That kind of thing would benefit. But something that was recorded to a digital audio workstation and properly mastered in 2020, I can't imagine there's going to be anything to achieve differently.
And if it was improperly mastered, they probably still don't care.
It is what it is, It's so. And then there might be purists even that would say, you know what, the cloudy nature of that 1964 jazz record that I've lived with that I loved, I don't want to hear it any different. I don't want to hear it any clear. Because there's a lot of people that go that didn't even like the original Beatles remasters. Like way before they started doing the remix, they go, okay, we're going to go back to the original stereo tapes or mono tapes, and we're going to do a completely badass playback on some pimped out 2-track and use our killer Prisms converters. And we'll be very respectful of the EQ, as opposed to how it had been maybe originally done in the hurry up, let's get as many things out on CD as possible, in 1985 or something. That's valid. But even a lot of people said, I have an original Beatles record and it's not, I still like that better than this, remaster. I don't know if I'm one of those people. I actually really like the remasters a lot. So I'm not going to comment about the remix. That's a whole separate thing. But the remasters, I think, were very well done.
How do you think mastering has changed since music streaming has been involved? Because sometimes when you look on the Apple Store, they'll be like, this was mastered for Apple specifically.
Right.
How has the idea, can you explore that idea with us? Like, what would that possibly mean?
It's kind of bullshit, I'll tell you.
It totally is.
Yeah. It's a marketing thing. It really doesn't mean anything. I'll tell you what the difference between something, mastered for Apple Digital Music or whatever it is. Basically, the file is turned down a fraction of a dB so that there's a tiny bit more headroom to make the MP3 from. So this is the chain of events. So I get something to master, and they invariably want it as loud as possible. So getting it loud, which is a whole discussion we probably don't have time for, to get it loud skillfully and still have it sound good is something me and a lot of other mastering engineers spend a lot of time figuring out. So, and this is something that we're compelled to do by the artist. This is not because it's our preference. So you see a lot of negative stuff in audiophile stuff about how the mastering ruined it or whatever. Well, it was maybe at the mastering process where it went beyond what it should have gone, but you can bet your bottom dollar it was like that because the artist wanted it like that.
Yeah, when I first started doing this with some of my engineering friends, I'd be like, what headphones do you listen to? I'm like, I got XYZ. And they're like, dude, half the time I just do it on Beats because that's what the end user will be listening to, right?
Yeah.
What's your take on that, Dave? On listening to gear that the consumer might be listening to?
I think it's okay to maybe sort of have an idea of how it's going to be listened to, but myself and I think most other mastering engineers would say that if the system that I listen to, I need it to be as super high resolution and as wide bandwidth as possible for me to really hear what's going on. I never intentionally skew the mastering toward thinking that it'll, this will work better on laptop speakers or on Beats or whatever like that. I just make it sound good on my big audiophile system, and then, it'll sound fine on any other systems. That's kind of the short version of that.
Yeah, I used to listen to it on I used to listen on like 15 different systems, but pretty much just the studio system now.
Well, you end up going crazy if you
end up going crazy, and I found it didn't make a difference.
Yeah.
It's like I can make it perfect to play off of an iPhone or earpods, but I can make it sound just fine off of those either way.
Yeah. I mean, I still do a car check once in a while, but I'll rarely change it based on what it sounds like in the car. I just kind of basically want to.
I found this plugin that you can put an app on your phone or connect to like a local Wi-Fi network, basically, and then the plugin will play from your master bus straight into the phone.
Oh, that's cool.
Whatever bitrate. So it was cool. I'll have to send it to you. It's kind of cool because you can have everyone in the studio basically then log in on their phone and listen to it on their earbuds off their iPhone.
I have actually had specific instances where I was requested after the fact to make a change so that it did, work better on a phone. And it wasn't like all of a sudden they wanted to try and get, bass out of a phone. It was that there was something that was distorting. I have found that once in a while, it's very uncommon, but once in a while, a mix will sound fine in here, but has some weird specific low-mid energy that will blow up the phone a lot easier than...
Yep. Yeah,
you know.
there's something in like 300
Yep.
hertz on a lot of iPhones.
Yeah.
It's very narrow band, super
Yep.
narrow band.
Yep.
But it's... And you can hear a lot of Ariana Grande's albums do this, actually, where there's like the harmonics on the kick are really high, and they do like a super deep notch cut, and then they bring up the section around it. So her like something about her kicks and her basses have really weird sound to them,
Yeah.
but they sound really good because of that off your iPhone or off earpods.
Yep.
You know, and on that note, I have this thing that I've often thought about, and I'd love to explore with you guys when listening to like these high-end stereo systems or even tracks, anything really. You get this sense that there is a part of the frequency spectrum that holds detail. So what is the perception of detail? Where does that lie? And is it ever tinkered with in audiophile recordings or any general recordings that you can kind of identify with? So like when you're mastering, you're like, oh, I need more resolution. Is the idea of resolution audiophile frequency trickery?
Yeah, so my take on this is kind of a little different, I think, than a lot of engineers, partially because I grew up in an audiophile household, and then a lot of what I did in school was actually very physics-based and sound research-based. So I think about two main things. One is the actual frequency response. So, you know, there are things like, oh, the treble holds that kind of sparkly high-end detail, or above, 8 to 10K, you get harmonic kind of, it's almost an ambient or sparkly sound, right? The low bass is going to have that rumble sound to it, things like that. But there's even some finer and more interesting relationships, like the low mids around 200, from about 100 hertz up to about, I'd say 300 or 400 hertz. You have this section that is where phase and time relationships in our ear overlap. And you have another section where those overlap. It's about 1600 hertz, and that's where your ear starts to use timing rather than phase difference. And then in the low mids is where it starts to use phase rather than time differences. And when you EQ those sections, you're actually changing the balance of what your ear is trying to pick out. And so, for me, and every engineer has a specific frequency they like to work with. 1 to 3K is really popular because that's a presence region. Our ears are super sensitive there. They can pick up a lot of stuff. So getting that to sound real natural and have nice detail and be nice and clean is important. But I actually think that 1600 hertz and that 250 hertz is really interesting because when you cut those or you saturate those or you do things to those, you can get a perception of not only warmth or brightness, but you can actually change the way things image. So a lot of people will change like 1 to 3K and then like 6K to try and sharpen up objects. And I'll actually go down and I'll do some compression and a little bit of gluing, a little bit of saturation, just real light stuff down around 250. And I can actually get images to sort of pop out of the soundstage without making them brighter. And the same goes for, unusual, like there's like some 5 kilohertz frequencies that are really important to how our ear localizes sound. You can do some funky things there where actually cutting sometimes and applying other effects can give you more detail rather than just boosting. So for me, I think about that phase relationship. I think about that timing relationship and how our ears hear a lot and how that interacts with frequency. My take on that is a little more scientific maybe than some people's, but that's the kind of stuff I look for. I'm always looking for solid images, a nice richness, and like a kind of just a holistic character that sounds. I don't want things to sound processed, so I'm always trying to get things to be as simple and as clean as possible. Even on more mainstream stuff or on video game or movie stuff, I'm always trying to look for that least processed, cleanest, most. I hate to use the word natural, but kind of that, I want the texture of the sound to really come out. And sometimes that resolution sits in places that aren't the conventionally accepted, 3K, 400 hertz, 100 hertz, 80 hertz. Sometimes there's other interesting stuff going on there.
Do you ever find that you receive mandates that are kind of the opposite direction of detail? So, like, is the idea of conveying detail and this type of transparency sometimes a back seat to just, it sounds good on my whatever, Because why doesn't every album strive to sound like the top tier audiophile albums?
I don't know about Dave, but I know for me, I get I actually get surprised. Maybe I'm just lucky. I get surprised by my clients who and what they hear. So, of course you get people who are like, well, the bass player said he wants more bass. And it's like, there's like so much bass already. And I'm like, you don't need any more bass. That would totally unbalance everything. And trying to work around that can be a pain in the butt. But I actually get clients who are like, hey, I'm hearing this weird little noise here. Or like, hey, I want a little more of that. And I'm like, how the heck did you hear that? What on earth? And I know that they're listening on just noise-canceling headphones or laptop speakers. So a lot of it is really like, what are they paying attention to and what are they hearing that is drawing their attention? So part of it's determined by the client. I do sometimes get requests like that. Usually, Dave, I'm sure, has stories that are a little crazier than mine. I actually don't get too many requests that are like people being unreasonable. But every once in a while, someone will be like, yeah, I need this to be... I need to be able to hear this thing more. And it's like, all right, well, that's just like an ear drilling, like 6K, like triangle hit. But you know what? I'm going to have to boost that shit because I'm just going to have to boost it because, if that's what they want, that's what they want to hear.
Yeah. Wow. This is a really, Bryan, you've kind of hit on a deep topic. Grover and I are certainly not alone, but I think in a bit of a minority in terms of people that have a music production, background coupled with an audiophile listening kind of sensibility. Well, first off, my absolute favorite recordings are the ones that tend to exhibit a lot of tonal information and a lot of harmonic information and a lot of kind of what you could term texture, but they're not particularly bright. And that is a very difficult thing to do. It's almost impossible to do it in the digital domain, and it's one reason why analog recordings sound so good. Because there's a thing about analog where the colorations that are built in kind of act as an additional actor in the play. It's really hard to do that in digital because sounds that are not bright in digital just sound dull and boring as shit, So you really have to work harder in digital to get, kind of juicy, non-super bright sounds, or add a judicious amount of top end in a very careful way that is still palatable, but just kind of tickles your ears and makes you, think there's a little carbonation going on.
Just to jump in, I love that carbonation. Just to jump in, one recording that for me, I don't know if you're familiar with this, one recording that does that for me a lot. I think it's 2011 remaster of Queen's Greatest Hits. Mm-hmm. Don't Stop Me Now, off of that album, that remaster is one of my favorite audiophile tracks.
I'll have to check it out. Yeah.
It's got all that wonderful texture. Like you can hear all the edges in Freddie Mercury's voice and all the weird little sounds. It's got amazing separation. But it still has that kind of, it's super clean, but it's super clean analog.
Yeah.
And it still has all that character and all that texture and all that like grit, but you can hear it in kind of high def.
Going back to Bryan's question, I have had people that very intentionally wanted their project to not be particularly bright, even if we're not talking about like too bright, but just like normal bright. They're like, no, we're okay with it being a little on the dark side. That speaks to us better. And I mean, I obviously respect, how they want to do it. But when I'm mastering, it's always what's the least amount of top end boost, if and frequently none, can I get away with and still have it sound, detailed and interesting and all that kind of stuff. So.
Are you kind of implying here that there is intrinsically a inverse relationship between detail, treble, and general listenability? Is the idea of detail a balance between being aggressive sounding?
Well, it depends. It depends where, because see, 6K is still treble. It's the low end of the treble. But it's much more aggressive sounding than, say, 12K. So you can kind of, frequencies above 10K are generally referred to in pro audio as the air frequencies. So you can lift the stuff subjectively at the very top, and it will just kind of give you a sense of detail without it sounding aggressively forward. I get a lot of recordings that really need more in 4 to 6K. That's where like certain EQs do it better than others, and it's kind of, you want your tools to be able to affect that area without it sounding harsh and too forward and stuff. But the delta between all those three things is that darker is perceived as having less detail, and too much, too bright, is too off-putting. So you're just always trying to find that mid area where it's got a satisfying amount of detail and it's not too forward.
And you kind of implied something very important, Dave. It really depends on the source material too.
Oh yeah,
right. Like electronic music, there can be stuff that's dancing around up in 8, 10, even 12 or 14K. That's really, you don't want too much of it because can be way, way hot.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you just have guitars and vocals and piano and stuff like that, you're not worrying about that range so much, other than for a little color.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, electronic stuff you can totally fry your tweeters.
Oh yeah, I work with a lot of electronic stuff, and so for me, it's always like that air band is like I actually do a lot of work there. It's not just shelves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you guys think that you've both walked around to a lot of audio shows and heard a lot of high-end systems targeted at a demographic of individual who might be losing some of their top-end hearing? Have you observed any changes in those speakers that might lean towards that spectrum, just to kind of flatten it out for people who are losing their top end? In a very simple way of saying this, do audiophile systems overcompensate on the high end to help with the target demographic they're trying to market towards?
I don't think so. Dave and I have actually talked about this a lot, especially at CAF this past year. I think it's not fair to make a generalization because there's a lot of different audiophile companies out there. But for me, and my hearing's still pretty good, I can still hear up around the 20K range, actually even a little bit higher than that. For the most part, audiophile systems above 10K, most tweeters are actually quite good. They're actually not weird. But there are a few rooms that I walk into and I'm like, what on God's green? It's like when you walk outside on a sunny day and someone's chrome bumper just like flashes like a reflected sun in your face. It's like some rooms have just this weird 16 to 18K like nasty grossness going on. But I would say most rooms, I don't find there are most of the speakers that are too bright. They're too bright well into the mid-range and low treble. Most speakers, I think there's a Studio Electric was a speaker we heard at CAF that it has a little bit of high-end rise in that like 14K type range, maybe even going a little bit lower than that. But it's not offensive. It's very tastefully done, and it's just a little bump up there. So I find that most audiophile speakers do that fairly well. And if they don't, then they're just way too bright to begin with, like everywhere. Like everyone would agree that they're really bright.
I totally agree with that. I have a little less experience at shows in hearing a broad cross-section of offerings and the audiophile market. I mean, I've heard quite a few, but I can't speak to this as well as Grover. But I've noticed an interesting thing over the course of my career, and that is that the trend for top end, there's two trends. There's the trend in the music production, and there's the trend in the playback. Things in, let's say, the 60s, had a certain kind of ragged top end because equalizers were not as advanced, and they were listening on low-res systems, and, it's just a matter of like, well, give me some more top, and they just crank it up, and people were listening on there's famous Beatles stories. Like they just go in and just pin the 10K, knob on everything. It's like, well, that's we just have one treble knob. Just pin it and let's go. And so the refinement of the quality of the top end in 60s recordings tends to be much more three colors of crayons. And systems were not particularly detailed. I mean, there's a couple of outliers in the 60s. I'm sure you had your electrostatics and quads, and there were systems that had a refined top end, but the level of the top end on the recordings didn't demand a lot of stuff. So when things got more refined on the production end, when you started to have really good sounding parametric equalizers and much more control during the recording process, people started to go, this top end that we could only go so far with the one knob and 10K that we're not going to pin, we can really make things tinkly and sparkly and carbonated up there. And you have like the height of that would be late 70s, something like Elton John. That shit is as bright as they can possibly get it, way up top with Neve EQs and with various things. And so then the stereos were not particularly jacked up on the top end because that was what everybody was producing. And if they were all tilted up, it would be unlistenable. So then digital comes in and everybody figures out that digital has a really annoying top end in the early days of digital. You can only get away with so much boost. And recordings in the early digital age got way darker in general than the height of the end of the analog era. And people quit. They're like, you know what? We can't boost all this top end up here because when it plays back on a CD, it sounds like shit and, all this kind of stuff. So the top end became very refined in the 90s. And if you compare a typical record from like 2001 to like a typical record from like 82, the record from 82 is way brighter. And so hi-fis kind of started to yin and yang. Instead of dark systems that would play back the height of analog with super bright Elton John records and stuff, they started going, well, this digital stuff is dark. We need to get some resolution going. So then they started to make the top end on the playback systems supply a little more of the, missing air or try and get more detail and stuff. And I think we've kind of reached a level of equilibrium at this point where the best digital recordings are not dark, they're not too bright, and the playback systems in general are pretty in the middle ground. They're not trying to go one way or the other.
I would say, too, just to add on to that I hear it especially in the low mids, high bass, and in the presence region and low treble. I grew up on speakers from the 90s, actually, not modern speakers. Mm-hmm. And there's a certain, to me, speakers before that era, from 70s and 80s that I've heard, there's a murkiness to the lower end, and there's to me, it's almost like a thrashy, it's just confused sounding, and there's too much energy in that high, mid, low treble sections. And modern speakers have less extension than some of those old systems actually, but tend to be a lot flatter in that mid-range.
Definitely.
Mid-range area.
Definitely.
We talked at CAF, it was like most of the mid-range systems on every setup there were flat. I mean, it's not hard to make a flat mid-range nowadays.
Yeah. The worst would be a speaker that was designed in the playback era where things were not very bright, and you have like a NHT or Paradigm or something like that.
Yeah.
And you play Captain Fantastic on that, you're gonna run screaming from the room.
It's the 4K is just gonna take off.
But Captain Fantastic on a pair of large Advents sounds amazing. It's
Absolutely.
it tail wags the dogs. I think we're at a really great point now, though, where the high end offerings are like really, really flat. So, from a frequency response perspective,
I agree.
But then you put some cartridge on it that's like 10 dB bright at 15K or something. This was kind of interesting. I was a little bit surprised when I didn't find this as much in Tampa. Tampa was a kind of a different deal. Maybe the hotel rooms were, the shape was different. But at CAF, almost all the systems I heard, except the big systems in the big rooms, had a really interesting wide. The ones that imaged had an impressive imaging kind of thing to them. Imaged really wide, but there was not a solid phantom center. It was like there wasn't anything in the middle, and stuff was coming out of the sides. And I want it all. I want like a really super solid 3-dimensional floating in air. I want the vocal to float right in the middle, and then all the other stuff, can be on the sides.
Even the big rooms at CAF, even some of the really, really nice rooms, the center image was not as solid as it could have been.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of audiophile manufacturers who have kind of a thing against toe-in. I think it depends obviously on how the speaker is made, but I noticed that mastering engineers and just mix engineers in general tend to toe-in speakers quite a bit more than audiophiles do.
I don't want any reflections from if I feel like the speaker is designed to be flat on axis. Not only do I want that, but I want less energy off axis to bounce around in the room, even if I've got the room all deadened and stuff.
Which is we've Dave and I have talked about this a couple of times. I actually have kind of the opposite take. I want the speakers towed in as little as possible.
Yeah.
But I also want them fairly wide apart. I think it's a lot of mastering engineers tend to have more of what Dave has, where the speakers are a little closer together, a little more towed in.
Yeah,
and they're hearing a tighter center image.
I'm also sitting pretty close to them. I mean, there's some mastering studios where they sit further back. I've been in a few of those, but in general, you're sitting in the front third of the room in an equilateral triangle, and the speakers are pointed right at you. It's almost like you having large headphones on. So,
and you're going to tend to put less presence region in there, is what I find. Is you're going to tend to jack the treble up less that way.
Yeah, well, that's why I kind of like having bright speakers as well. So, my studio listening setup is not anything I'd probably want to listen to at home, but it's accentuated in a way that helps me come up with something that's not too extreme.
I just want to kind of thank both of you guys for jumping on to do this with us. I think it's been very informative.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Occasional Podcast Season 4. The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes PartTimeAudiophile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA Newsletter, and AudioHead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.